The sun rose over Ur, bathing the brown brick ziggurats and clustered dwellings in a haze of dust and amber light. In this ancient Sumerian city, one of the earliest cradles of civilization life was measured not in moments, but in tokens, seals, and ledgers. Somewhere within its temple precincts, a man named Idilpisha stirred from his straw mat, unaware that history would remember not his name, but his numbers. Itul was not a warrior, nor a king. He was a scribe, a keeper of accounts. His job, to document every goat, jar of oil, and barley sack that entered or exited the temple's storage rooms. His tools were simple reed stylus, clay tablets, and years of repetition dot as dawn colored the sky. Etel washed with water carried from the river and wrapped himself in a linen kilt. The Sumerians were meticulous, not just in numbers but in ritual. Cleanliness, silence, order, these were the accountant's virtues. He left his home, passed through the buzzing market of fishmongers and wool traders, and arrived at the temple compound, its colossal mud brick facade already warming under the Mesopotamian sun. The air inside the accounting chamber was still. No chanting priests, no sacrificial bulls. Just shelves stacked with hardened clay, each piece etched in cuneiform, each one proof of the temple's holdings. Etel took his seat at the low bench. A fresh tablet, still damp, waited before him. Today's work would involve balancing accounts from the previous week's offerings. 24 goats given by farmers in Nippur, 8 jars of sesame oil from a merchant caravan, and 1 broken tally stick from a shepherd claiming exemption. Each transaction began the same way. Etel would moisten the clay just enough to make impressions. The number of items was denoted by repeated wedge marks. The item itself encoded using pictographs. For example, indicated barley, while the word GU signified cattle. Long hours bent over this primitive data entry, back aching, fingers grayed by dust, were punctuated only by the occasional creak of reed sandals in the corridor. But these accountants did more than write. They audited. At the end of the day, Etel was expected to reconcile goods received with temple disbursements. Discrepancies were rare. A jar missing? Etel would request verification from the warehouse overseer. A goat unfit for sacrifice? He would make a notation, circle it in reed ink, and wait for the high priest's ruling. You might wonder why such care. Because in Sumer, the temple was not just a place of worship. It was the city's bank, its granary, its archive. Every surplus of grain was weighed, every debt inscribed, every dowry, divorce, and donation logged onto the eternal clay. Etel's status was modest, but his power was vast. He controlled the knowledge of who owed what to whom. When the temple prepared to trade with merchants from Elam or Dilmun, it was Etel's ledgers that guided negotiations. His records even held the names of slaves and workers, including how many hours they'd toiled dredging canals or planting barley. Yet Etel, for all his influence, lived a routine existence. Meals were a small bowl of cooked dates or flatbread. Conversations were minimal. Leisure was rare and simple, a moment watching birds at the river, or a story murmured by firelight about how the gods taught men to count. Most days blurred into the next. One week, he accounted for 50 bricks offered by a mason guild. Another, he copied a list of fish deliveries, carp, perch, and some mysterious entry, likely mistranslated as river dragons. His life was uneventful, even by the slow standards of temple life. Still, the job required precision. One wrong impression on a tablet could change the value of a shipment, or worse, imply theft. Etel had heard stories of scribes exiled for errors sent to dig ditches on the city's edge. He triple-checked his work and avoided wine at lunchtime. Over time, Etel developed a rhythm. By midday, he would finish most entries. By afternoon, he compiled summaries for the priestly council. He'd wrap tablets in linen, seal them with his personalized stamp, a simple, marks shaped like a bent reed, and passed them on to runners who delivered them across the temple complex. Outside, the world changed. Floods came and receded, wars flared in distant city-states, and new rulers ascended. But inside the accounting hall, life remained steady, dull, and unchanging, just the way Edel liked it. Yet even in this predictable monotony, questions lingered. Where did these numbers go after he recorded them? Did the gods truly read the tablets offered in their honor? Was all this counting, the barley, the goats, the bricks actually shaping history, or merely preserving it? And most importantly, in an age before coins and credit, was it possible that a scribe like Edel, hunched over clay in the temple shadows, held the true power of civilization? You return to the clay-filled quiet of the temple accounting hall, where Edelpeisha's world is shaped not by sweeping conquest or tales of gods, but by the steady scratching of a reed stylus. Day after day, he tracks what most would ignore: sacks of grain, baskets of dried fish, and bundles of woven textiles, all rendered in the delicate dents of cuneiform script. Edel sits cross-legged at his bench as morning sunlight bleeds through the slatted walls, casting shadows like ledgers across the floor. Today, he must audit the temple's end-of-season storehouse report, a dense tablet over 30 centimeters wide, detailing the inflow and outflow of every commodity from the past 3 moons. Barley has been short, possibly due to early rains that rotted the southern canal crops. Edel records this gently. Grain returns not met. Harvest affected by Enki's waters. But numbers are not the only burdens he carries. Edel is 42 now, the oldest in his guild of scribes. His beard, once trimmed, now curls with neglect at the corners. His hands are thick from years of shaping tablets, pressing impressions. With ritual precision, younger scribes have begun to join the guild sons of merchants. Even one former potter's apprentice who learned to write by accident while delivering food. Edel trains them silently, not through teaching, but by example. He writes, they observe. There is one, Dumuzi, who sits opposite him, curious and fidgeting. Edel notices the boy scratching jokes into discarded clay fragments, cartoonish cows with crossed eyes, merchants with bellies as big as grain jars. Edel does not reprimand him. Instead, he hands him a broken tablet and asks him to copy today's. Don't tally. Dumuzi smirks, but obeys. Such was the world of Sumerian accounting, not just numbers, but the silent education of responsibility. You did not simply write. You inscribed a reality. Every transaction carried consequence. Edel knew this deeply, especially when preparing inheritance ledgers. These were among the most delicate documents a scribe could author. A widow's land, herds passed to her sons, or sometimes denied to them. Occasionally, disputes arose. Man with 3 sons and only 1 field. Edel would be summoned to the outer court, tablet in hand, to read the father's recorded last will, his voice even and firm as bickering heirs glared at one another. It wasn't the priest or judge who held the deciding truth. It was Enlil's script. This, perhaps, gave the accountant a weighty form of power. Edel once remarked to himself, silently, the king may rule the people, but we rule what they leave behind. At noon, temple meals are shared by status. Edel eats near the granary overseer stew, lentils, flatbread, and figs. Conversations drift to speculation. Would the barley quotas improve next harvest? Will Elamite traders renew their contracts? Will the god Enlil favor their city over Kish this year? Edel listens more than he speaks. He's not one for temple politics. His thoughts dwell elsewhere, on procedure, on keeping clay dry, on making sure none of the young scribes press too hard and crack a tablet mid-etching. Afternoons are given to reading old records. Today, Edel must verify the storage logs of a now-dead merchant who once donated his herd to the temple. A priest suspects foul play. The merchant's son is now claiming tax exemption. Edel must locate and read the original donation record, etched some 12 years earlier on brittle clay stored in the lower archive. The archive smells of dust and age. Shelves grown under the weight of decades, even centuries of records. Edel removes his sandals and walks slowly, reverently. To be among these tablets is to be among ghosts. He locates the entry cracked slightly at one edge, but the cuneiform is unmistakable. 5 oxen, marked with a double notch on the left horn, donated by Nannerson of Lunanurta to the Temple of Enlil. No clause of tax exemption, just a full surrender. Edel returns and makes his report. The priest sighs. The merchant's son will be furious. But the record stands and still. The clay keeps coming in 1 week. Edel will assist in preparing an annual trade agreement for 3 boatloads of dyed wool, heading to the port at Eridu. The agreement will require 6 witnesses and 6 tablets, each to be dried, wrapped, and sealed with separate seals. 1 for each party, 1 for the temple, 1 for the gods, 1 to be broken in case of dispute. These contracts are ceremonial, but binding. Edel takes no pleasure in them. Too formal. Too many eyes. He prefers the daily dullness. The kind of monotony that lets one disappear into a dot as twilight darkens the city. Edel walks home. Clay dust still under his fingernails. Children play in the alleyways with knucklebones. A woman sings a prayer to Nana, the moon god. Edel reaches his doorway, ducks inside, and lights a tiny oil lamp. He sits, drinks water from a chipped clay cup, and picks up a smooth tablet, not for work, but for a personal list. How many days of oil remain? What repairs are needed for his roof? Whether Dumuzi shows promise. He presses marks into the clay. Slowly, carefully. This too is accounting, though it will never enter the temple's records. And still he wonders. When he is gone, what will become of the thousands of tablets he has touched? Will future scribes ever read them? Will they puzzle over his seal, shaped like a bent reed, and ask, who was this man, and why did he record everything so meticulously? Night in Ur arrives not with silence, but with stillness. The city exhales. Temple fires din to coals, streets empty of traders, and only the river continues its patient lapping against the stone. Adilpaisha sits under the open roof of his small courtyard, knees stiff, sipping weak beer from a shared cup. Somewhere in the alley beyond, a flute plays, lilting and faint. His work for the day is finished. The tablets have been sorted. The records of goat herds and grain rations have been sealed and handed off to temple runners. He should feel satisfaction, but instead, he feels time slipping. Edel is nearing the end of his career. His seal, his stylus, even his bench, these will soon pass to another. He thinks again of Dumuzi. The boy's lines are clean now. His numerals are legible, his tallying accurate. He even began keeping his own logbook, an unofficial journal of what Edel refers to half-jokingly as errors, oddities, and omissions. It's a good habit. Edel approves silently. He has never been fond of praise. In Sumer, they say that a good scribe is one whose work is never noticed, because it is never wrong. And yet, in this quiet moment, Edel allows himself to wonder what it all means. He has written thousands of tablets. Some of them hold nothing more than commodity inventories. 17 jars sesame oil, inspected by Ahuzi, accepted into Temple C. Others detail seasonal crop yields or the wages paid in. Barley and beer to ditch diggers, shepherds, and millers. He has documented dowries, punishments, and death taxes. Once, he even recorded the full account of a man sentenced to temple servitude for lying about a fish delivery. Still, Edel knows this truth. None of it was his dot. All he has done is record the will of others. The priests gave the orders. The merchants made the trades. The kings sent the messengers. Edel merely shaped the clay. He was in the end a vessel like the amphorae he counted. But perhaps that is the point. Sumer thrived because it remembered. And memory was not held in minds, but in tablets. You could forget the date of a debt, but the clay would not. You might lie about the number of sheep tithed, but the records would remain. Without men like Edel, there would be no certainty, no trade, no trust. There is one tablet Edel has never shown anyone. He keeps it wrapped in linen, buried under a pile of rejected shards. It's not a ledger or legal record. It is a name list. Names of the men and women he has worked alongside. The warehouse clerk who died of a snakebite. The overseer who once tried to bribe him. The assistant who could never remember the sign for ox. Edel wrote their names down one evening, 15 years ago. He added a mark next to each when they left or died. The list has grown long. He touches the clay gently tonight, smoothing the linen around it. It feels heavier than any receipt or inventory. The next morning, he visits the ziggurat priest. He makes a quiet request. When he dies, his seal should not be passed on. He has carved a small wooden box into which it should be placed and buried beneath the archive shelves. The priest nods. A trivial request from an untrivial man. Later that week, Edel records his final major transaction. 3 boatloads have died. Wool to be shipped downriver to the port of Eridu. The contract is signed by 6 witnesses. Edel presses his seal last. A neat reed-shaped, simple, unpretentious, consistent. He does not return to the scriptorium after that. A younger scribe takes his place. The bench is cleaned, his tablet pile dispersed, the scroll of tools passed on. Only his seal box disappears. Quietly into the clay brick vault beneath the records hall, between broken ledgers of ancient beer taxes and festival grain rations. Edel dies quietly a few months later. No procession, no monument. Just a name written once more, this time by someone else on a funeral listing. Adult by Isha. Scribe. Temple of Enlo. Sealed 1,147 ledgers. But centuries later, long after Ur's temples fall and its streets are buried, in dust, a team of archaeologists will uncover a hardened clay tablet in remarkable condition. It lists 17 jars of sesame oil, dated precisely, signed with a reed-shaped mark. They will pause, photograph it, then carefully label it. Inventory tablet, circa 2100 BCE, Ur, Sumerian script. Possibly related to trade with Elam. They won't know Edel's story. They won't know the sound of his stylus, the ache of his back, the care in each line. But his numbers will remain . And in the end, that was all he ever wanted. Story 2. Keeping time in a Babylonian water clock workshop in the sprawling, sun-drenched city of Babylon, surrounded by the great mud brick walls and crisscrossed by canals. Teeming with boats and shouting vendors, time itself moved differently. Not slowly, not quickly, but deliberately, almost ceremonially, one drop at a time. You would have heard of kings and conquerors, the hanging gardens or the zigzag patterns on Babylonian temple walls. But tucked in the less poetic corners of the city, near the ziggurat's shadow and downwind from the fish stalls, was a simple, flat-roofed building. There, behind unmarked doors and beneath layers of soot and sand, the city's most overlooked. Innovation trickled on in silence. The water clock workshop. Inside, a man named Nabo-Edin spent most of his days hunched over clay basins and copper bowls. He was not an engineer in the modern sense, but neither was he just a potter. He was, by the logic of his time, a timekeeper, a technician of controlled flow, of interval, and of patience. The water clock, or clepsydra, was the Babylonian answer to timekeeping where shadows failed. When sundials were useless during overcast days at night, or in the deeper chambers of temples, water clocks stepped in. The principle was simple. Water dripped at a predictable rate through a small hole in a container. By measuring how long it took to fill or empty a second container, one could calculate the passage of time. Simple in theory, miserably tedious. In practice, Naboiddin's job was to calibrate these devices for temple ceremonies, market regulations, and legal trials. Even minor imprecisions, say, a clogged aperture or a bowl warped from overfiring, could result in misaligned rituals or accusations of injustice. A temple priest once yelled at him for a clock that ran too fast during a lunar ceremony, causing offerings to be burned early. The omens were unfavorable, apparently. Naboiddin received no thanks when they ran on time. Each morning, he entered the workshop before sunrise. His first task was to check the humidity. If the air was too thick, it could affect evaporation rates. He would adjust the aperture of each water bowl using a fine reed or chipped obsidian needle, testing the drip interval by counting aloud to himself. 1, 2, 3. Then he'd tilt a reference bowl and record how long it took to fill another. You might imagine this work as peaceful, meditative even. But it wasn't. It was filled with minor frustrations, bowls cracking in the viandas, reed plugs swelling with water, or rats chewing through the workshop's leather seals. Naboiddin kept a running list of such setbacks in a crude wax tablet near his bench. Most days, he worked in the company of two apprentices, Tilu and Zamas Urkba. Both were teenagers, sons of a retired record keeper. They bickered often, spilled water more often, and sometimes tried to race each other in bowl-filling contests. Naboiddin scolded them gently. "Time is not a game," he would mutter, "though men pretend it is." The workshop supplied not only temples, but also administrative offices. Certain legal contracts required the presence of a functioning water clock to track the length of testimony. Market stalls were regulated by time-based tolls, 1 bucket of dates for every 4 hours of operation. And prisoners were held in judgment chambers where water clocks ensured fairness in debate. In this sense, Naboiddin's tools served as silent arbiters of justice and trade. His own records were meticulous. He kept small clay tablets documenting each clock's calibration, location, and service history. For example, Bowl 12, Temple of Marduk, Inner Shrine, aperture 1.4 millimeters, drip rate 86 per sec, tested 12th day of Tammuz. These logs would be sent weekly to the Office of Temple Supplies. Sometimes they were ignored. Other times, they returned with complaints: water too fast, bowl crooked, please replace. Despite all this, Naboiddin took quiet pride in his work. Babylon may have been a city of power, priests, and prophecy, but it was also a city that ran on rhythm. Time flowed, quite literally, through his hands. Midday brought a short pause. Lunch was usually barley cakes and lentils eaten in the shade. The scent of clay and stagnant water thick in the air. Tilu once asked him, "Master, why not just let the priests watch the sun?" Naboiddin smiled. "Because the sun does not care about your contracts." As the day wore on, he turned to repairs. A shipment of new copper bowls had arrived. Each with slight manufacturing defects, too wide, too thin, or uneven rims. He used a block of volcanic stone to smooth the lips and reform the bases with gentle tapping. Then, he'd begin the endless testing again. Fill, drip, measure, record. By evening, the workshop was filled with the low sound of water dripping into stoneware, steady, rhythmic, hypnotic. The apprentices had gone home. Naboiddin remained, adjusting one last clock for the palace astrologer. This one required extraordinary precision. It would be used during an eclipse next week, when priests would count the seconds between darkness and light. He finished his work, washed his hands, and stepped outside. The streets were dim now, oil lamps flickering. The canals quieted. As he walked home, he passed a merchant arguing about scales, a boy drawing lines in the dirt, and an old man watching the sky. Time moved for them, as it did for everyone, but none of them noticed the bowl that measured it. Nabo-Idin did, and still he wondered, how long would his clocks last? Would anyone remember the men who measured time by the drip of water? Or would his name, like so many others, wash away with the river silt? Time, to most Babylonians, was marked in events. The lighting of temple fires, the opening of markets, the sounding of horns at the palace gates. But for Nabo-Idin, time was a slow, methodical process, shaped by water droplets and the imperfections of hand-forged bowls. Inside the workshop, the morning haze had barely lifted as he prepared for another full day of calibration. His reed-bound notebook lay open beside a tray of small, identically sized stones counters used to track test intervals. Each stone represented a specific number of drips, and each cluster of stones stood for an hour in the temple's ceremonial calendar. Nabo-Idin stared at bowl 17, a copper clepsydra meant for the courtroom of the merchant district. It had failed 2 tests already. The aperture drilled into the basin wall was too wide. The water escaped too quickly, causing a discrepancy of nearly 4 minutes over a 4-hour span. Unacceptable. In Babylon, 4 minutes could mean a mistrial or, worse, an offering made at the wrong divine hour. He gently scraped the edge of the hole with a sharp obsidian shard, then plugged it with a sliver of cane and reapplied a bitumen seal. Then, the test. A full fill, a counter bowl below, and a quiet wait. Drip, drip, drip dot with each drop. Nabo-Idin counted aloud not by numbers, but by syllables from an old hymn to Aa, the god of wisdom. Aa in the deep, watcher of time, bearer of knowledge, master of drops. Each line was a placeholder, a mental metronome passed down from generations of water technicians before him. This was the tradition of Babylonian waterkeepers. Science, cloaked in song. Zamas Arkba entered the room late, still chewing a date. Telu followed, hauling a tray of water jugs. "We're out of bitumen, master," he said, breathless. Nabo-Idin sighed. Bitumen shortages were common, and the temple storehouse was increasingly stingy with its allotments. He scribbled a note on a tablet. Request: 3 flasks of sealing bitumen. Reason: temple klepsydras unserviceable. Stamped it. Rolled it. Set it aside for the afternoon runner. Later that morning, a temple official arrived in a fuss. "Your clock in the House of Tablets is running too slowly," he barked. Nabo-Idin asked for the calibration record. It was fine, but the clerk would not hear it. "Fix it anyway," he ordered. Nabo-Idin remained calm. "Bring me the bowl," he said. "I'll see to it." The real issue, he suspected, was the uneven floor in that temple hall. A tilted surface could skew the water flow, and no adjustment of aperture would fix that. He had suggested leveling the slab months ago. No one had listened. They rarely did as midday heat pooled inside the mud brick walls. The apprentices prepared 2 test runs on newly built timepieces. These were standard 4-hour models, simple in shape but tricky to balance. Nabo-Idin checked their measurements. "The line markings are uneven," he said. "One side will fill too quickly. Start again." Telu groaned. "Master, nobody checks that closely." "No one has to," Nabo-Idin replied. "But we do." This was the curse and the calling of his trade. The entire city flowed with activity governed by vague clocks and shifting calendars. And yet, in the center of it all, a few quiet men labored to keep the hours from unraveling. There were no parades for water clock technicians. No hymns were sung in their honor. But if the water flowed too slowly or too fast, chaos would bloom. Legal sessions could be invalidated. Market fees miscounted. Priestly rituals spoiled. Each afternoon, the workshop produced a single formal report to submit to the temple council. It included data on bowl performance, drip rate adjustments, seal condition, and scheduled maintenance for each deployed clepsydra. Naboedin drafted the report with care, each line recorded in cuneiform on soft clay. The apprentices didn't understand why he insisted on such detail. Samaz Urkba even asked, "Why do we bother writing all this, master? Most of these clocks are forgotten once they're delivered." Naboedin considered this, "Because a record lasts," he said at last. "Even when the bowl breaks, the record tells someone that time was once kept correctly." By early evening, Naboedin walked alone to a shrine on the workshop's roof. There, he maintained a ceremonial clock used only during eclipses and celestial omens. It had a twin drip system, meant to mark seconds, if one could even call them that, in much finer increments. Tonight, it would be tested under the stars. He sat beside it as dusk deepened, watching the drips fall into a shallow bronze tray. The sound was hypnotic. Each drop a heartbeat of Babylon. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the future. Would clocks still drip like this 1,000 years from now? Would someone, somewhere, remember this odd tradition of measuring time by water, not by wheels? Or wires? Or would it all vanish, his notes, his bowls, his small sacrifices to precision like a drop lost in the Tigris? The sky over Babylon was unusually clear that evening. The stars pierced the darkness with rare sharpness, and the crescent moon hung low over the ziggurat. It was an omen night. Somewhere in the temple, astrologers whispered predictions about the coming lunar alignment. Priests performed purification rituals, and scribes read aloud from ancient omen tablets. But atop a quiet roof, surrounded by nothing but the soft trickle of water and the breath of evening wind, Naboedin was focused. On a bowl, this bowl was unlike any other he had calibrated. It was ceremonial, gilded at the rim and embossed with markings of the god Sin deity of the moon, keeper of secrets. The high priest had requested it specifically for the eclipse event, an astronomical occurrence rare enough that some believed. It marked shifts in the very favor of the gods. The timing had to be perfect. The bowl's aperture had been drilled under Naboedid's own supervision. The markings, inked with care by his youngest apprentice, aligned precisely with the astronomer's instructions. The drop rate had been tested across 3 days, under different temperatures and conditions. Still, Naboedin wasn't satisfied. The moon rose slowly. Temple bells sounded once low and solemn. Samazurkba arrived quietly with a jug of fresh water. "The astrologers are in place, master," he whispered. Naboedin nodded and began the ritual fill. Slowly, carefully, water trickled from the jug into the bowl. The surface rippled, then stilled. The tray beneath waited, already marked with calibration stones. When the first shadow crept across the moon, Naboedin counted. Not with numbers, but with breath and rhythm, and the memory of all the bowls he had balanced, all the drops he had tracked. The eclipse lasted a full 22 minutes. The bowl performed flawlessly the next morning. Temple runners came to collect the eclipse bowl. It would be stored in the shrine archive, likely never used again. Naboedin handed it off with care, not reverence. He didn't believe the bowl divine, but he believed in its precision. His apprentices cheered the success. Even Tilu, who usually grumbled, seemed impressed. "It worked, master." They said it matched the star charts exactly. Naboedin nodded. "It should." That afternoon, he did something unusual. He removed his own name tablet from the archive shelf, took it outside, and placed it next to the entrance of the workshop. It was a modest clay tablet, marked only with his name and seal a simple sunburst. Between 2 drops of water, Tillu asked, "Are you retiring?" "Not yet," Naboidin replied. "But soon." He spent the rest of the day reviewing the full year's calibration reports. Errors were minimal. The bowls were intact. The apprentices, though noisy, were competent. He wrote a short addendum. This year's clepsydras met all calibration standards. The House of Time continues its service. Signed, Naboidin. Then he placed the tablet among the annual records. In the days that followed, he taught less. He observed more. He let the apprentices prepare the bowls, test the water, make the measurements. When they failed, he corrected them with fewer words. More gestures. Eventually, he stopped attending the workshops altogether. Years passed. Babylon changed. New kings rose. Old temples fell. Calendars shifted. But in quiet corners of the city, time was still kept by bowls and drips, by silence and clay. A century later, when a new ziggurat was constructed on the city's northern side, workers uncovered a buried chamber filled with old timekeeping tools, bowls, records, stone counters. Among them was a sealed tablet bearing a name almost lost to dust. Naboidin, water clock keeper, servant of time. It was catalogued and set aside, its significance unclear. Just another artifact in a sea of ancient debris. And yet, the bowl beside it still held a dried aperture, clean and smooth, as if waiting for water once more. In the grand sweep of Babylonian history, Naboidin was a forgotten figure. But the time he measured and the silence he worked in became the hidden heartbeat of an empire. Because someone once had the patience to count the drips. Story 3. The brick counters of Mohenjo-Daro for Babylon rose. Before scribes etched clay in Sumer or chariots rolled through Egypt, a city flourished along the banks of the Indus River. Mohenjo-Daro, its name meaning mound of the dead, was not a city of pyramids or empires, but of order, grids, and bricks. Thousands upon thousands of bricks. You would not find grand inscriptions or lavish palaces here. Instead, you would see uniform streets, sophisticated drainage systems, and a quiet commitment to infrastructure. It was a city of function. A city that measured not time, but material, especially bricks. And behind every neatly stacked kill-fired brick wall stood a small, rarely mentioned class of people, the brick counters. One of them was a man named Dia. He was neither priest nor builder. His task was more mundane. He verified that every house, platform, bath, and warehouse used the proper number and type of bricks according to the civic records. Too many bricks, a tax might apply. Too few? Structural failure. Dia's job was to count. Not with a pen, not with a stylus, but with his eyes, fingers, and tally stones. Each morning, Dia would rise before the city's mud brick homes warmed under the sun. His dwelling was modest 2 rooms, 1 small window, a mat of woven jute for sleeping. He wrapped his waist in linen and packed his bag with the same tools every day. A tally slate, a stick for drawing lines in dirt, a pouch of standard-sized counters, and a folded inspection sheet made of beaten palm fibers. Deha worked for the city's construction guild, not the masons, but the regulators. His role was part auditor, part inspector, and entirely uncelebrated. He walked from site to site, counting rows, measuring angles, confirming that every platform adhered to the prescribed size, usually bricks in ratios of 4 to 2 to 1, the distinctive Indus proportion. Deviations were rare but serious. A misplaced brick might mean water would pool in the wrong place. Flooding, not war, was the enemy here. This was a city built beside a river that gave life and took it away. Dea's greatest challenge wasn't bricks, but silt every year. The Indus shifted slightly, and its waters deposited a new layer of fine mud across parts of the city. Old buildings had to be elevated, foundations rebuilt. Dia's inspections would sometimes involve recounting structures buried under years of sediment. He developed a technique: insert a reed at intervals, feel for the resistance of fired brick, mark the depth, then record how many courses had survived beneath the surface. It was slow, dirty work. His fingers were permanently stained with gray dust. Most of his reports were the same. Kill batch 77 used for warehouse. 4C. Compliant. Total: 13,824 bricks. Drainage alignment verified. But some days, surprises appeared. Once, he found an illegal kill built in a hidden yard near the western wall. The bricks were of poor quality, uneven in size, and used for constructing a bathing platform without city sanction. Dia reported it. The platform was dismantled. The kill owner fined. Quietly, Dia was respected for his discretion. He never named the builder, just submitted his count. He kept to himself. Lunch was lentils and barley, eaten sitting on the ledge of a half-built wall. He preferred silent sites, where the echo of his stone counters tapping against brick helped him think. Tap, 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 one for each course. Clack, a misplaced joint. He'd mark it, make a note, move on. Dia had a small group of junior counters who occasionally followed him. They were curious but impatient. Why measure the bricks again? One of them asked. The wall is already standing. Dia didn't answer. Instead, he led them to a collapsed corner near the south gate. A structure built hastily the year before. Bricks misaligned. No drainage vent. One heavy rain had been enough. He gestured to the ruin. Because this is what happens when you don't count. The boy was quiet after that. Dia's own records were stored in the guild archive, wrapped in woven leaf sleeves and stamped with a seal carved into a piece of shell. His symbol: 3 stacked bricks under a line. Simple, like his job. He never added flourishes, never speculated. Just counted by evening. He returned home, washed his hands in a small pot of river water, sat beside his hearth, and like every evening, updated his private brick tally. Not required by the guild, just a habit. A personal count of every brick he had verified. The number was now over 1.2 million. He wrote it without emotion, not pride, not boredom. Just completion. Still, as night crept over Mohenjo-Daro and the river, whispered beyond the walls, Dia sometimes wondered, were these bricks so carefully counted, so precisely laid, truly permanent? Would floods carry them away one day? Would anyone remember that once someone walked this city with nothing but a bag of counters, ensuring that everything aligned? Or would his life, like the bricks he inspected, be buried beneath time and silt? Morning in Mohenjo-Daro began with the familiar sounds of clay carts creaking and river birds crying over the rooftops. The city was not a place of noise. It buzzed with the steady energy of labor, not spectacle. Its people rarely made headlines in future history books, but they were among the most methodical, perhaps even the most quietly advanced of their age. Dia rose early, as always, slipping into his routine like water into the riverbed. His eyes drifted toward the horizon. The floodplain shimmered slightly moist, untrustworthy. He knew the rains had been heavier this year. That meant inspections needed to move faster. Today's assignment was near the granary platform, a massive storage site of fired brick, raised on a plinth to protect it from floodwaters. But what Dia would inspect was not the granary itself. It was the repair wall behind it, built hastily after last year's partial collapse. City administrators had promised it was temporary, but temporary often became permanent in Mohenjo-Daro. He arrived with his stone counters and a string grid. The junior counters followed, slower and muttering complaints about the mud. Dia ignored them. He placed the grid across the wall's base and began counting. Quietly, carefully, tap by tap. Within minutes, he found irregularities. The bottom. Coarse bricks were uneven, some larger than the standard unit, others crumbling around the edges. He checked the kill stamp. No mark. These weren't guild bricks. Dia side dotted meant someone had used unauthorized material, likely from a defunct kill or even scavenged from collapsed homes. It wasn't illegal, but it was discouraged. Recycled bricks weakened structures, especially in a flood-prone zone. He noted his findings on palm fiber paper, rubbing the tally with a streak of indigo dye. That marked the report for further inspection. As the sun climbed higher, he continued his circuit. A water outlet inspection near the upper market, a review of step bathing platforms in District F, and a cross-check on brick taxes paid by a potter's guild. This last one required entering the guild hall and comparing delivery records against a tablet scratched with trade symbols, dotted red. 2,000 bricks delivered. Type B, Series 5. Payment, 10 flax bundles. But the actual count, verified by Dia's tally board, showed only 1,800 bricks delivered. He made a small note, no accusation, just numbers. Later, back at the brick registry office, he quietly slid his report into the archive slot. The overseer, a broad-shouldered woman named Raymay, looked up briefly and nodded. "You're the only one who still checks these things line by line," she said. Dia shrugged. "That's what the line is for." Raymay smiled. "We're sending you to the northern boundary tomorrow. They're planning an embankment." Dia didn't reply. He just nodded and left at home that evening. He sat in his courtyard and reviewed his personal records. One tally caught his eye: structure 14A in the east sector. Built 4 years ago. Recently inspected. Still standing. He remembered the builders, young, fast, eager to move on. He had corrected them many times. Real. Strength is not in speed, but in weight. He sipped water and stared at the ceiling. Above him, baked bricks formed an arch that had lasted nearly 2 decades without repair. His own home. His own hands. And yet, in his quiet solitude, he often wondered, would anyone remember the brick counters? Would their names survive beneath the mounds of discarded pottery, collapsed wells, and buried platforms? Mohenjo-Daro was not a city that sang the praises of individuals. There were no grand statues, no named kings carved into stone. Only bricks, millions of them and each brick told a story of patience, planning, and precision. Sometimes, Deha thought about the future. Would this city survive the centuries? Would the granaries still stand? Or would the river finally win, silting over everything, turning streets into sediment and records into dust? Would someone, thousands of years from now, ever find one of his reports, one of his careful marks scratched in the fiber or clay? Would they pause and wonder who had counted these ancient bricks and why? And what would they see? A civilization that built in silence, and a man who, without fame or celebration, measured it all one brick at a time. The northern embankment was a mess. Dia stood knee-deep in silt, his sandals long abandoned to the sludge, staring at a partially constructed, retaining wall. The bricks were unevenly fired, some swollen, others cracked before they had even left the kiln. The workers were nowhere in sight. The site had clearly been abandoned after the last rainfall, and no one had returned to clean or finish the work. He squatted and tapped gently at the first layer of brick. Clack. Clack. Thud. That one wasn't fully dried, likely placed in haste. The mortar was already crumbling. Dia reached into his pouch and removed a palm fiber tally sheet. Rain had warped it slightly, but the tally stones were intact. He began to count, one row at a time, each brick measured. Each layer noted. First course, 44 bricks. Standard, good alignment. Second course, 47 bricks. Irregular, note, minor overhang on east edge. Third course, 39 bricks. Incomplete, gaps between units. By the eighth course, he stopped writing dot. It was obvious. The embankment wouldn't hold. Not under a real flood. Maybe not even under a heavy rain. Back at the registry, he submitted a formal defect notice. Structure unsuitable. Suggest full dismantling and use of kill-fired Series 4 bricks. Rebuild on compacted soil. He stamped it with his seal and handed it to Ramai. She scanned it, raised her brow. They'll fight this, I know. They'll say it's good enough. Dia nodded slowly, until it isn't. In the weeks that followed, the rains returned. Not in a single storm, but in steady, relentless downpours. The Indus swelled. Floodwaters lapped at the outer districts. Residents moved their goods to higher platforms. Dia moved with them, not to evacuate, but to inspect. He made his way back to the northern embankment. It was gone. The wall had collapsed. Bricks scattered like pebbles. A stream now coursed where the foundation had been. He picked up a single brick, examined it, one of the flawed, water-swollen ones, and dropped it again into the rising tide. He didn't file a new report. The damage spoke for itself. In the months after the flood, Dia's work became heavier. He had to recount houses, recertify brick deliveries, and measure repairs with a sharp eye. His steps slowed, his joints stiffened, but his tally remained exact. One evening, while compiling a year-end review for the Guild archive, he did something he had never done before. He wrote his own name on the last sheet. Under the final tally, a neat column of brick counts, drainage approvals, and correction notices, he added, "All records verified by Dia, brick counter of Mohenjo-Daro." Then, quietly, he pressed his seal. 3 stacked bricks and a single line. No flourish, no praise, just a name. He folded the sheet, wrapped it in palm leaf, and stored it with the rest. Not long after, he stopped coming to the registry. Some say he moved inland to avoid another flood. Others say he died quietly in his home, his last breath as even and measured as his brick tallies. No one knows for certain. But centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro streets buried in layers of silt walls, tilted and cracked, they were struck by the uniformity of the bricks. All of them, millions of them, bore the same proportions, 4 to 2 to 1. Somewhere, in a mud-filled chamber, they found a single inscription scratched into the base of a drainage platform. It read, in crude Indus script, "Counted, checked, verified." There was no signature, but the lines were straight, the bricks aligned. The drainage still worked, and somewhere perhaps, Dia's spirit rested, knowing that even in silence, even in anonymity, his work endured. Because sometimes, the people who leave the least behind leave the most that lasts. Story 4. How a Roman road inspector filed his reports. Rome is remembered for its legions, emperors, aqueducts, and marble monuments, but its true backbone, quite literally, was made of crushed stone and sweat. Via Romane, the roads of Rome stretched over 250,000 miles at their peak, carved across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. And to keep that mighty empire moving, someone had to check the roads. Not the generals, not the poets, but men like Marcus Longinus Verus, a Roman road inspector. Marcus was not a centurion. He wore no armor. He commanded no men. His uniform consisted of a tunic, worn sandals, a rolled scroll, and a wax tablet tied at the waist. His tools? A measuring rod, a plumb bob, and the unglamorous power of the Imperial Survey Office. That you imagine Rome as fast-moving chariots clattering, soldiers marching in lockstep. But Marcus's world moved slowly. He walked. Every inch of road he inspected was under his direct scrutiny, one foot after the other, stone by stone, mile after mile. He reported to the curators virum, the Roman officials responsible for road upkeep. These officials rarely left the city. Marcus, on the other hand, left. Rome months ago. His assigned region was southern Gaul, a land of rolling hills, vineyards, and cracked milestones. Each morning began the same way. He rose with the first light, ate a modest breakfast of barley bread, cheese, and diluted wine, and checked his inspection scroll. It was updated monthly by courier. Segment: Via Agrippa. Station 88 to Station 94. Assigned: Mem Longinus Verus. Status: overdue for inspection. He packed his tools, adjusted his cloak, and began walking. At every milpasum, roughly every Roman mile, he would stop, examine the miliarium, a carved stone marker, and record its condition. Was the inscription still legible? Was the stone upright? Had local vandals scratched graffiti into it? All of this went into his wax tablet. Then came the road surface. Marcus inspected the pavement layer by layer. The stadamen, foundation of large stones. The rudis, middle layer of gravel and lime. The summum dorsum, top layer of polygonal stone slabs. He checked for displacements, sinkage, weeds, and water pooling. If a cartwheel had worn a groove deeper than half a finger's width, it went into his report. One of his most tedious tasks was measuring the road width at key segments. Every Roman road had legal minimums, often about 15 Roman feet, roughly 4.5 meters, for two-way cart traffic. Marcus would stop, lay out his rod, record the width, and note any narrowing. In the mountains, roads were often too narrow, but still had to be documented. Travel wasn't glamorous. He stayed in roadside inns, mansionese, or sometimes under a tree. He dealt with blisters, rain, mule dung, and the occasional surly farmer. He'd been chased by dogs. Once, he had to pull a broken axle out of a drainage ditch to prove that poor road curvature had contributed to a merchant's accident. Despite it all, he was proud of his role. Rome thrived not just because of conquest, but because of connection. Messages, troops, food, taxes all moved on these roads. And roads crumbled if no one watched them. At Station 91, he encountered a problematic stretch. A recent storm had loosened several paving stones. Water had begun seeping into the rudis. Nearby, a drain was clogged with mud and branches. Marcus marked it. Drain obstruction. Summum dorsum stones dislodged. Hazard to carts. Immediate repair required. He drew a quick sketch into the margin of his scroll using a stylus dipped in charcoal paste. Later, he would copy the field notes onto vellum, translate them into proper Latin, and submit them by courier to the curators in Massalia. Whether they acted on, it was out of his hands. Each day's walk was about 12 to 15 miles. Slow progress, considering how little actually changed in appearance. But Marcus knew what he was looking for. The road told a story: cracks, grooves, discoloration, weeds. They were all signs of age and neglect. His scroll grew longer with every step. He cataloged not just physical damage, but local repairs. Towns were expected to maintain segments near their borders. In some villages, he found stonework replaced with brick illegal. Others used clay or dirt patches, temporary at best. Marcus never fined anyone directly, but he made sure the infractions reached the right officials. He kept a private record too, coded notes carved into the side of his walking staff. Each notch marked a segment he believed would never be fixed. No matter how many reports he filed. In the evenings, he copied notes into his master scroll. By oil lamp or firelight, he would translate scrawled wax marks into clean, legible Latin. Sometimes he added personal comments. Station 92. Hostile locals. Guard presence advised. Station 94. Best olives I've tasted. Recommend preserving. Grove. These notes were never read officially, but they gave him company. Still, as he watched the sun set behind the hills of Gaul, Marcus sometimes asked himself, would these roads outlive him? Would his careful notes and inked sketches make any difference? Or would the stones simply fade, the ditches clog, and the empire forget that once someone walked the distance and wrote it all down? It was late summer when Marcus Longinus Verres reached Station 95 on the Via Agrippa, an unassuming marker standing near a low, weather-worn hill. The milestone was half buried in ivy. The inscription naming Emperor Antoninus Pius was barely visible under layers of lichen. Still, Marcus pulled a damp rag from his satchel and began scrubbing. The stone beneath the grime read, I'm a PKST, Al Hadger Antoninus Ev Pivs Pont Max Trib Pot Kos. I. He muttered it aloud, both to test his memory and to entertain himself. There were no listeners but the wind and a tired crow nesting in the mile marker's crevice. When he finished, he marked the inscription as legible with effort in his scroll. He had now walked nearly 200 miles of road in just under 3 weeks. His calves ached. His sandals were worn thin. His ink had run dry and had to be replaced with a mixture of soot and leftover wine. But the real burden was not physical. It was bureaucratic. He had sent 3 repair notices so far. The dislodged paving stones near Station 91, a cracked bridge at Station 89, and an entire segment of washed-out road where a hillside had collapsed in the spring. Each of these required city funds, approval from local magistrates, and contracted labor from nearby villages. That meant delay. Marcus had learned not to expect miracles. The curators Virum and Massalia were prompt with parchment and procedure, but rarely with workers and stone. His notices might not trigger action for months, if at all. Today's inspection led him into a town just off the main road Vicus Lapidarius. The village sat near a quarry and had once produced fine stonework for the legions. Now it was mostly mud, sheep, and loud opinions. He arrived during midday rest, when most men dozed under awnings and the women baked flatbread in outdoor ovens. He asked to speak to the duovir, the local magistrate. He was eventually brought to a shaded veranda where the duovir, a broad, sunburned man in a stained tunic, looked him over with suspicion. You're from Rome? I'm from the roads, Marcus replied. Via Agrippa. Section 95. I need your crew to clear debris from the southern slope. The man grunted. They're harvesting olives. Marcus unrolled the wax tablet and showed the sketch. If it's not cleared, the next storm will take the whole path. You'll lose your wall. The duovir snorted. If we fix one path, Rome will ask us to fix the next. It never ends. Marcus didn't argue. He knew better. Instead, he thanked the man politely, rolled up his tablet, and left. He would mark the site again, add a notation to his master scroll, and move on. The road didn't wait. Later that evening, he reached a small mansio, an official rest stop for couriers and inspectors like him. There, by candlelight and the crackling of a meager hearth, he copied the day's notes, segment 95, milestone partially obscured, cleaned manually. Recommend minor relocation to prevent further ivy overgrowth. Drainage inspection. Functional, but partially blocked by leaf sediment. Vicus lapidarius non-compliant. Verbal warning issued. Follow-up inspection required next season. He folded the scroll carefully and sealed it with a blob of wax, pressing his insignia into it, a Ramong L and a measuring rod. Then he tucked it into the courier box mounted at the edge of the mansio wall. As the wind rose, he sat by the fire with a cup of diluted wine. An old road worker passed through, noticing Marcus's gear. "You're a viator?" he asked, using the colloquial term for road agents. "I am," Marcus said, "still fixing stones no one sees." Marcus smiled. "Someone has to." The man nodded. "I walked this road 40 years ago with the Legion. Same stones, same curves. You know, there used to be a plum tree near Station 87. Marcus raised his brow. "Still there. Barely." They chuckled. In that moment, Marcus felt the quiet satisfaction of his obscure trade. The roads endured, and so did the people who quietly kept them usable. That night, he wrote one final line in his private journal. Station 95. Plum tree, still holding on. Like the road, like me. But still he wondered, would Rome, in all its glory, ever notice the men who walked the roads for her? The ones who didn't build, but simply checked, corrected, and carried the dust on their feet? Would a time come when no one knew what a viator was? Or would they be remembered only through the grooves worn in stone by their quiet steps? Marcus Longinus Verus reached the final segment of his assigned inspection with the limp of a man who had spent too many years walking. His calves were tight. One sandal was wrapped in twine to keep the sole from flapping, and his tunic, once bleached white, was now the color of tired dust. But his eyes were sharp, always scanning. The stretch between stations 95 and 100 was known as the Long Mile, a deceptively straight segment carved across a shallow valley, bordered on both sides by farmland. From a distance, it appeared perfect, smooth, even, timeless. But Marcus knew better. He began, as always, by walking the center line. He noted depressions where carts had gouged shallow tracks into the pavement. One of the side drains was choked with overgrowth, its grading blocked with clay and roots. A section of roadside stones had shifted slightly outward, probably the result of cattle being driven over them again and again, softening the earth beneath. He stopped and wrote, Segment 98. Road integrity stable. Lateral stone displacement noted. Drainage obstruction vegetative. Recommend clearing before autumn. He paused and looked up. A young boy was watching him from a distance, no older than 10, barefoot, chewing on a reed stalk. He stepped closer. "Are you the man who measures rocks?" Marcus smiled. "That's one way to put it." The boy tilted his head. "Why do you write it down if nothing's broken?" "Because if I don't," Marcus said, "something will break, and no one will know why." The boy seemed unimpressed. "I think they'll forget anyway." Marcus nodded. "They might." That night, he reached station 101, column half-toppled at the base of a cypress tree. It marked the end of his assigned route. He sat beside it, back against the stone, and unrolled his scroll. In the dim firelight, he read over the dozens of entries, each one exact, measured, forgettable dot. He pulled out a clean wax tablet. After a long silence, he carved one last line. Inspection route complete. All stations recorded. No serious obstructions. Traveler Marcus Longinus Verus, in service of Rome. He paused, then added, Some roads crumble. Some hold, but the feet keep walking. He packed away his tools and began the slow return journey to Massalia. Not to the Grand Forum, nor to the marble steps of senators, but to the postal station where he would deliver his final scroll, collect his modest pay, and wait for his next assignment. By the time Marcus reached Massalia, weeks had passed. The road office clerk barely looked up as Marcus placed the sealed scroll on the desk. Any notable incidents? Marcus shook his head. Nothing Rome would notice. Good. You'll be reassigned by spring. Maybe Lusitania. Marcus didn't respond. He simply nodded and left. That evening, in a rented room above a fishmonger's stall, he lay down without unpacking. He stared at the cracked ceiling. It reminded him of Station 94, where the moss grew in patterns like stars. He smiled at the thought. Years later, no one remembered Marcus Longinus Verus. His reports gathered dust in a side room of the Curators Virum, eventually lost during a fire. The roads remained for a while, but archaeologists would one day unearth fragments of the Via Agrippa. They would find grooves from carts, misaligned stones, and a section where vegetation had once overrun a drainage line dot in the records. There was a note. Segment 98. Obstruction noted. No evidence of clearance. The historian copied it into a footnote and moved on. But Marcus had walked that road. He had measured it. Not because it was glorious, but because someone had to care. Even if the empire didn single quotes the dot, because without the ones who quietly measured, corrected, and recorded, the roads to glory would have collapsed long before the legions arrived. Story 5. The Forgotten Paper. Trail of Tang Dynasty tax clerks. Chang'an, the imperial capital of the Tang Dynasty, pulsed with splendor. Palace gates rose high. Temple bells echoed over red-tiled roofs, and the air carried the scent of sandalwood and boiled rice. Courtiers moved in silk, warriors trained in courtyards, and scholars recited verses beneath apricot trees that behind the grandeur. Buried in corridors of paper and the silent breath of bureaucracy, worked the tax clerks, the ones who kept the empire's golden dragon fed. Among them was Liu Ren, a clerk of no distinction. No court titles, no fame. He worked in the Southern Taxation Bureau, 3rd Division, under the Ministry of Revenue. His world was made of bamboo brushes, paper scrolls, and ledger lines. He did not see battles or issue decrees. He reconciled numbers. Each day, Liu Ren arrived at the office before sunrise. The bureaucratic district of Chang'an was already alive, with foot traffic messengers hurrying with satchels, bailiffs posting notices, and scribes sharpening brushes with slivers of shell. Liu passed through the red gate marked with the character tax and entered a low building where scrolls outnumbered people. His desk was simple: a worn wooden surface, an inkstone, a pot of soot-based ink, a reed brush, and 3 ledgers, one public, one private, and one not entirely official. The public ledger was what the ministry expected to see. It listed amounts owed by each prefecture, measured in grain, silk bolts, coins, or corvée labor. The private ledger was for internal tracking, where discrepancies were noted and reconciled discreetly. The 3rd ledger was his own. Handwritten in fine, cramped characters, it contained what Liu called the truth. Uncollected taxes quietly forgiven. Bribes given as timai. Overpayments by desperate farmers hoping to avoid labor service. He never intended to reveal this 3rd ledger, but he couldn't help keeping it. That day's assignment was reviewing reports from 2 distant prefectures. One, Yanzhou, had declared a surplus of 300 bushels of grain. The other, Huazhou, claimed poor harvests and requested a reduction. Liu flipped through previous reports. Last year, Yanzhou had claimed a deficit. Odd. He noted the inconsistency with a small red mark. He cross-referenced population estimates, irrigation records, and grain transport logs from the regional granaries. A number didn't match too. Much grain had apparently been transported from a prefecture that had no surplus. He paused, sipped bitter tea, and dipped his brush again. Then he wrote into the margin, figures padded to offset imperial quota. Likely falsified. He wouldn't report it, not yet. Not unless he found evidence across multiple years. False accusations were dangerous, especially when local governors were powerful. By mid-morning, the bureau hall buzzed with clerks, each hunched over scrolls, copying, adding, squinting. The only sound was the scratch of brushes, interrupted occasionally by sneezes from paper dust. Liu preferred it that way. He worked under the supervision of Bureau Chief Saul, a rotund man with sharp eyes and a fondness for salted plums. Song rarely praised, but he once told Liu, "You write like a man afraid of being remembered. Good. That's the proper way." Liu took it as a compliment. By afternoon, Liu reviewed the labor service rolls from Huazhou. Hundreds of names listed. Under Ding, taxable male citizens. Some were crossed out. A few replaced by mysterious annotations. Relieved. Deceased. Merchant. He recognized a pattern. Too many men were suddenly exempt. He wrote quietly in his personal ledger. Possible forgery of service rolls. Unusually high exemptions. Compared with previous census, this wasn't corruption on a grand scale. No missing chests of gold. Just numbers bent like reeds in water. Small lies repeated. The truth of the Tang dynasty was that the empire ran on paperwork and paperwork could be manipulated. Liu had learned early that complaining did little. A fellow clerk had once reported a miscount in coin tax from the capital. Market. Within days, he was reassigned to border service, a poetic punishment for a man who disliked walking dots. So, Liu wrote his truth into his hidden book. Quietly. Safely. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that one day someone would find it and understand. At dusk, the clerks packed up their scrolls, cleaned their brushes, and blew out the oil lamps. Liu remained behind, tidying his papers. Before leaving, he opened his secret ledger and added one last line. No bloodshed today, only numbers. Still, he wondered, would this hidden trail of paper, these careful notations in invisible ink, ever be read again? Would anyone know the truth behind the grain counts, the silk quotas, the service rolls? Or would the empire's great record, so carefully inscribed in public scrolls, become a mask, hiding all the small truths Liu had quietly counted and kept? A chill settled over Chang'an the next morning as Liu Ren arrived at the bureau earlier than usual. Fog clung to the tiled roofs, softening the usually sharp silhouettes of the capital. He liked this time, before the bustle, before the overseers. Just the sound of his own footsteps on the stone floor and the faint creak of bamboo partitions. He unrolled his scrolls methodically. 1, 2, 3. The same ritual every day. Today's task was a carryover, a grain reconciliation between the Ministry of Revenue and the reports sent from the Luoyang office, another major hub of the Tang administration. Both claimed accuracy. Neither matched. Liu said, inked his brush, and prepared to chase the truth through rows and rows of overlapping numbers. The trouble started with tax grain shipment vouchers. The prefecture of Shangshan claimed to have sent 1,200 dan, approximately 180 liters per dan, to Luoyang's central granary. But Luoyang only confirmed the receipt of 1,080 dan. Somewhere, 120 dan, roughly 21,600 liters of rice, had vanished. It wasn't the first time. Liu's finger ran down an older scroll from 2 years earlier. The same prefecture had a similar shortfall, then 105 dan, lost to spoilage, the report said. Yet the weather records for that month, filed by the Ministry of Rights, showed no rain or flooding. He dipped his brush again. Pattern of underdelivery. Repeating discrepancy, likely siphoned at loading stage. He made the note on his private ledger. For the public scroll, he merely marked a red circle beside the entry. A gentle nudge to his supervisor, Bureau Chief Song, that the figures warranted a second glance, but no accusation. That was Liu's way. He worked between the lines. Later, as junior clerks filed in, yawning and brushing dust from their sleeves, Liu turned his attention to exemption petitions. These were requests from individuals claiming exemption from taxes or corvée service due to age, disability, illness, widowhood, or other status recognized by imperial law. There were 34 petitions. In today's stack, Liu read each one. Petition 7. a farmer named Gao Shen claimed permanent leg injury from a collapsed grain silo. Attached was a testimony from a village elder. Petition 12. A widow, age 57, requested exemption on behalf of her only son, age 14, who was her sole source of support. Petition 19. A Vos scholar claimed that the intensity of study had made him unfit for farm labor. Liu carefully examined each. Petition 19 made him sigh. He wrote in the margin, without malice, request lacks precedent. Decline. The others he reviewed with quiet concentration. In his private ledger, he began a new column, exemptions granted this month, by prefecture and category. Why did he do this? No one asked him to. But over the years, he'd begun to notice patterns. Some prefectures showed sudden spikes in exemptions. Others appeared unusually strict. A hidden web of local leniency, harshness, and favoritism rippled across the tax rolls. He kept these patterns for himself. Chief Song wandered in around midday, sucking on a plum and peering over Liu's shoulder. Still on exemptions? Yes, sir. Don't get too sentimental. Song warned. The forms lie. So do the people. I know, Liu replied. But the numbers don't. Not for long. Song chuckled. And yet we never quite catch them, do we? No, sir, Liu said. But it's not about catching them. It's about knowing where they run. Song patted him on the shoulder and left. Later that day, a courier runner from a northern province arrived with a bundle of scrolls strapped to his back. They were damp from rain and smelled faintly of vinegar. Liu helped him lay them out too. Dry, then began cataloging them one by one. Among them was a scroll marked in a different style older script. More careful brushwork. It was a census ledger from 2 decades earlier. Liu opened it with curiosity. Names lined the scroll. Heads of households, labor counts, field plots. He scanned until a name caught his eye. Liu Shen, his father. A simple line. Liu Shen. 1. Ox. 2 mu of rice land. 1 son, not yet taxable. That son, Liu realized, was himself. He traced a line with his finger. For a moment, the paperwork didn't feel so abstract. It was the story of lives in brushstrokes. A family once recorded and now largely gone. He carefully copied the entry into his personal ledger. Not for policy, not for investigation. Just to remember. The rest of the day passed as usual, reviewing, recording, annotating. The pile of scrolls shrank. The room darkened. Before leaving, Liu closed his third ledger, the secret one, and whispered, almost as a ritual, the paper remembers, even if the palace forgets. Still, he wondered, would these ledgers, his careful, uncelebrated work, survive the chaos of dynasties? Would anyone in some far-off age ever see in his scrolls the quiet heartbeat of a vast machine? A record not of emperors or wars, but of human lives counted, missed, misrepresented, and occasionally rescued. Or would it all burn in one of the many palace fires that history never forgets, even as it forgets the ones who tried to keep the count? Autumn swept across Chang'an, like a calligrapher's brush, crisp and precise. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves, smoke from tea fires, and the faint inkiness of decaying scrolls. In the Southern Taxation Bureau, Liu Ren moved slower now. Not out of age, but weariness. He had been a tax clerk for 22 years. He had survived 2 emperors, 4 bureau chiefs, 1 outbreak of foot rot, and countless grain shortages. The ledgers he had written could stretch from the Ministry of Revenue to the Eastern Gates. Yet he was still here, hunched under the flickering oil lamp, brushing characters into fields of parchment like a monk illuminating scripture. But he was not writing scripture. He was reviewing a tax amnesty declaration, an edict from the imperial court, forgiving missed taxes in 7 drought-affected provinces. A compassionate act, at least on the surface. But Liu had read enough to know better. He compared the edict to the actual revenue loss figures. The numbers didn't match. The prefecture of you had read enough to know better. He compared the edict to the actual revenue loss figures. The numbers didn't match. The prefecture of Runzhou had claimed a 40% crop failure. The drought records from the Ministry of Agriculture listed only 12% regional damage. Somehow, an additional 28% of tax had been forgiven, and the difference had likely gone into someone's private storeroom. He sighed. The corruption wasn't new, but it was growing more confident. He made 3 versions of the analysis. A formal memo with cautious language, sent to Bureau Chief Song. A private ledger entry, noting each prefecture's variance in bold. Red. A 3rd version, tucked into the back of his secret ledger, with personal reflections. This is the pattern now: sympathy for the suffering, but more sympathy for the wealthy. Amnesty that empties the granaries, but fills the silos of those who need no forgiveness. Still, he did not report the discrepancy. His role was not protest, but record. That evening, the Bureau held a modest tea gathering. Song was retiring. A replacement was coming from Liu Yang. Liu didn't know his name. The younger clerks murmured about reforms. Fewer scrolls, more abacuses. Maybe even early versions of woodblock datasheets. Faster. More efficient, they said. Liu sipped his tea and nodded, silently mourning what would be lost, the nuance between lines, the little details that didn't fit into ledgers but revealed everything. The next day, he came to work to find a tremor of chaos in the hall. A fire. Not in the Taxation Bureau, but in the Ministry Archive building across the canal. Lightning, perhaps. Or a cooking fire that spread. Whatever the cause, hundreds of scrolls, legal, financial, census, were lost. Liu watched from a bridge as smoke rose from the vault. The air smelled of scorched ink and wet bamboo. He didn't speak. That afternoon, he returned to his desk and opened his secret ledger, the one no one knew about. It contained every quiet miscount, every truth smoothed over for the sake of simplicity. It was not neat. It was not state-approved. It was the Empire, unedited. He looked at the bound scroll for a long time. Then, without ceremony, he wrapped it in oilcloth, sealed it with wax, and placed it inside a hollowed wooden ledger case marked the grain calculations, Yizhou 710 to 712, a label no one would bother opening. He walked down to the sub-archive vault, the driest, most neglected corner of the Taxation Bureau, and slid it into a row of unrequested reports. Dust already clung to its edges. Perfect dot, he left no note. He did not mention it to anyone. That night, at home, he wrote in his daily journal, "The fire will come for all of it someday, but perhaps something will remain, and someone will wonder why it was written so carefully by a man who expected no one to read it." He closed the journal and went to sleep. He never returned to the bureau. His absence wasn't noted immediately. When it was, a junior clerk assumed illness. A week later, the new bureau chief reassigned Liu's desk and had his scrolls reorganized, most copied, some discarded. But the oilcloth bundle, labeled as dull grain data, remained undisturbed. Forgotten, buried in paperwork. Centuries later, beneath layers of ash and imperial stone, archaeologists uncovered charred scrolls and burnt wood in the ruins of a former administrative building in ancient Chang'an. Most records were unreadable, but among them was one unusually preserved case, its contents dry and intact. Inside, they found ledgers handwritten, detailed, dated, and oddly honest. One researcher noted, unknown clerk. Style suggests late 8th century. Contains personal observations and figures not consistent with official records. Possibly dissenting? Possibly truth. But the label said, grain calculations. So they filed it under economic archives and moved on. Yet one footnote was added, a rare look at the quieter structures beneath Tang governance. The paper trail of someone who cared. And so Liu Ren, the forgotten clerk, lived on not in titles, statues, or stories, but in the margins. Story 6. Inside the warehouse logs of an Athenian olive merchant, Athens in the 4th century BCE shimmered under the weight of its own reputation. The Parthenon crowned the Acropolis. Orators filled the agora with arguments. Philosophers paced and questioned. Democracy, drama, and the divine intertwined in public life. But beneath this glow, in the warehouse shadows behind the port of Piraeus, lay a quieter engine of Athenian power. Olive oil dot, and at the center of this quiet industry was Ionas, an olive merchant, not wealthy, not poor, but entirely necessary. His name would never appear in a Platonic dialogue, nor be carved in marble. But every month, his logbook helped grease the gears of an empire. Ionas was not a grower. He was a coordinator, managing the flow of oil between the groves of Attica and the shipholds of foreign traders. His world was made of cracked amphorae, chipped scales, stained tunics, and scrolls smudged with accounting marks. He rose before sunrise, as the fishermen left the harbor and the bakers pulled bread from clay ovens. His warehouse sat by the western quay, unremarkable, except for the black line painted on the wall at hip height. It marked the last high flood. Ionas checked it weekly. Athens ran on debate, but drowned in negligence. Inside, long rows of amphorae stood like soldiers, each marked with a stamped seal. The grove of origin, the date of pressing, and the inspection weight. Ionas kept 2 ledgers, one for transactions, sales, weights, names, drachmae, one for spoilage, cracked jars, fermented oil, spillage. The second ledger was heavier. Each morning began with inspection. He would walk the aisles with a reed stylus and wax tablet, tapping amphorae, sniffing for sourness, and chalking X's on damaged ones. He recorded everything. Batch 4 3A, 7 amphorae, 2 cracked, 1 weeping at base, oil likely unfit for export. By mid-morning, traders arrived, Phoenicians, Corinthians, even a few Egyptians. They were loud, always in a hurry, always questioning weights. Ionas stood firm. His scales were calibrated. His seals were trusted. Not because he shouted louder, but because his records were consistent. He kept a tally of every shipment, not just what left, but what returned. That morning, he logged the return of 3 amphorae marked from Lesbos. The oil had congealed, spoiled in transit. He rolled the jars aside and marked the merchant's account for partial credit. A young apprentice new to the docks asked why Ionas didn't just resell the oil locally. Ionas replied without looking up, because bad oil ruins trust, and trust is more valuable than olives. Later that day, he met with a local farmer named Theocles, who wanted to renegotiate his share of profits from the last harvest. Ionas brought out the scroll. You delivered 112 amphorae. I sold 96. 6 cracked, 4 spoiled. The rest still in stock. Your share was 32 drachmae. Paid, 2nd week of Bodromion. Theocles blinked. He had no scroll, no counter-record. But Ionas did. The farmer left grumbling, but not disputing. As the sun lowered, Ionas prepared for the evening audit. He dipped his brush in ink, unrolled a fresh piece of parchment, and began listing the day's totals. Oil received, 18 amphorae oil sold, 12 amphorae losses, 3 amphorae spillage, spoilage, oil remaining, 276 amphorae coin collected, 48 drachmae, no dramatic entries. Just numbers, lined like infantry on the page. His hands were dark with ink. His back ached. His dinner would be cold lentils and a slice of goat cheese. But his books balanced. And that, to Ionas, was satisfaction. Before he closed up, he made one final entry not in the transaction ledger, but in a small private scroll kept hidden beneath his tunic. Warehouse stable. Oil steady. No fraud detected. One jar wept quietly by the door, as do we all, some days. And still, he wondered, would Athens remember the men who never debated in the agora? The ones who kept count, weighed, recorded, cleaned, and sealed? Would anyone ever study a life made of ink stains and broken jars? Or would the city only remember the statues, never the olive oil that made them shine? The following week began with trouble. Ionas arrived at the warehouse before dawn, as he always did. The port of Piraeus was already humming, ropes creaked. Donkeys brayed, and traders barked orders at half-asleep apprentices. But something was wrong. 3 amphorae had been moved, not rolled neatly to the loading platform as was standard practice, but dragged, leaving crooked tracks in the dust. 1 amphora was turned slightly, its base sticky. A broken seal. Ionas knelt beside it. The wax was still soft. Someone had tampered with it overnight. He stood slowly and said nothing. Just made a mark on his wax tablet. 4-3A. Third jar seal broken. Contents suspicious. Do not sell. Then he added a mark to a second tablet, a more private one. Suspected theft or dilution. Monitor closely. This wasn't uncommon. Olive oil was precious. A single amphora could fetch the equivalent of week's wages, especially if it came from the groves near Eleusis. Some warehouse boys siphoned a little off and replaced it with sedimented wine or water. A clever eye could disguise it. A dishonest one could make it vanish. Ionas had dealt with this before. Quietly, firmly, no beatings, no threats. Just numbers dot. He would track weights over the next week. Compare volume against seal integrity. Any discrepancies, and the boy responsible would be quietly let go. Word would spread, and that would be enough. By midday, business resumed. A Phoenician trader, wide-shouldered and perfumed, arrived demanding 20 amphorae for a fast shipment to Sidon. He wanted the best batch. Ionas walked him through the top aisle, pointing out the freshest jars. This one pressed Bodromian. Second week. Good color. Tight seal. Still weeping slightly from the press sign of freshness. The trader poked at the seal with a calloused thumb. Is it light? No. It's honest, Ionas said. The man grunted. I'll take 15. If any spoil, I'll take it out of your hide. Ionas smiled politely. The oil lasts. If your ship doesn't, speak to Poseidon. As the jars were loaded, Ionas recorded each one. He even documented the weight of the clay amphorae themselves, subtracting tare weight from total mass. He didn't trust averages. Each jar was different. His log read, batch 4-3A. Jar 1 minus 41 kilograms total, 8.5 kilograms tare. Gives net 32.5 kilograms. Jar 2 to 39.8 kilograms total, 8.4 kilograms tare. Gives net 31.4 kilograms. Jar 15 to 40.3 kilograms total, 8.6 kilograms tare. Gives net 31.7 kilograms. Total, 472.1 kilograms olive oil shipped to Sidon. Paid in silver coins. Documented. He stamped the page, placed it in the silver-ringed ledger, and handed the Phoenician his copy. In the afternoon, Ionas took a break and sat beneath the warehouse awning. He peeled a fig, chewed thoughtfully, and stared at the high floodlight on the wall. Some years, the water came halfway up the jars. Other years, not at all. He had lost 87 amphorae in a flood 2 winters ago. The clay stains still marked the walls. He had written about it in his ledger with no flourish. Inventory destroyed. Storm from the west. No recovery. That had been his harshest entry. Later that day, a customer returned with a complaint. 1 jar smelled foul. Fermented. Oil turned to sludge. Ionis nodded, sniffed the jar himself, and replaced it without hesitation. "Free of charge," he said. "I'll take the loss." The man left, surprised. But Ionis wrote in the spoilage ledger, 4.3 a jar 6, sour, possibly compromised during storage. Review temperature. Check ventilation. He then made a third entry in his personal scroll. 2 jars spoiled. 1. Seal broken. 1 suspicion. Same batch. Check origin. Farm of Myron near Mount Hymettus. Possible laxity in pressing or transport. Will avoid buying from him next season unless corrected. This was his quiet power. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He wrote. And when someone's name stopped appearing in his purchase records, others noticed Dodd as dusk fell. Ionis sat on his counting stool and reviewed the day's log. All numbers balanced. Losses recorded. Trades sealed. Suspicions noted, but not declared. He dipped his brush into the final jar of ink and scribbled a line at the bottom of his private page. Athens loves its marble, but without oil, it doesn't shine. Still, he wondered, would the scrolls he so carefully kept ever matter to anyone? Would some future scholar dig through a warehouse ruin, find his ledgers, and see in the numbers not just weight, cost, and quantity, but a glimpse of a city's lifeblood? Or would his name fade like spoiled oil in the cracks of a forgotten amphora? It was the end of the month, and Ionis was exhausted. The olive harvest had peaked early that season, and his warehouse was near capacity. Amphorae stood in tight rows, 3 deep, each one pressed with seals, brush marks, and the smudged fingerprints of dock workers. The air inside was thick with the scent of olives ripe, slightly bitter, with a hint of clay and salt. Outside, the cries of porters and gulls echoed through the streets of Piraeus. Inside, Ionis sat at his low table, surrounded by ledgers, each one tied with twine and annotated in careful, slanted Greek script. He flipped through the scrolls like a priest, reading from scripture-measured, reverent, focused dot. Today was the annual full inventory. He started at the back row oldest jars first. He tapped each with the flat of his palm, then weighed them using his balance scale. One at a time. No guesses. No estimates. Dot. He recorded. Batch 39B. 12 amphorae remaining. 3 light. Possible evaporation. Batch 40A. 8 jars. 1 chipped. Clay flaking. At base. Move for immediate sale. Batch 41C. 15 jars. Stable. Excellent condition. Midway through, a jar cracked while being lifted. A clean vertical line split the neck. Oil spilled slowly, pooling beneath the shelf in a golden puddle. Ionis didn't flinch. He simply marked it. Loss, 1 amphora. Cracked during shift. Estimated loss, 32 kilograms. Value, 5 drachmae. He wiped the oil with a rag, scrubbed the floor with lime ash, and continued. By evening, the full inventory was complete. 347 amphorae total. 18 spoiled or broken since last count. 4 unaccounted for. He would investigate those likely miscounted during offloading in the West Isle. He made a note for the next day. Then, as always, he opened his private scroll and added a final reflection. The warehouse stands. The oil flows. A few jars lost, as always. No theft confirmed, but trust is not weightless. 1 boy replaced. He didn't match the scale. Another season closes. Ionis did not see himself as a merchant, really. He was a custodian, a witness to supply and demand, honesty and deceit. His job was to record, to notice, and to maintain balance, not just of the scales, but of the entire quiet system beneath Athens' grandeur. He knew philosophers debated ethics in the agora, but to him, ethics lived in the difference between 31.8 kilograms and 32.1 kilograms. That was where you found character. Once, a trader asked him why he didn't hire more help, expand to another warehouse, maybe start a second operation in Delos. Ionas answered simply, because I only have 2 hands and 1. Truth. And that is enough to manage. Years passed. The city changed. War came and went. Markets collapsed and rose. The names of prominent men echoed in statues, marble plaques, and memory. Ionas's warehouse passed to a cousin's son. His ledgers, packed in clay jars, were stored in a back room wrapped in linen, sealed with wax. One rainy night, long after Ionas had died, a roof tile collapsed and water seeped in. Many scrolls were ruined, but one clay jar remained sealed. Inside it, a scroll marked only with the symbol of an olive branch and 3 dots, his personal sign. Centuries later, archaeologists found it beneath the rubble of ancient Piraeus. They unrolled the scroll slowly, puzzled by its contents, thought it was not philosophy. It was not poetry, just a list of oil jars. Notes on spoilage. A few entries about broken seals and evaporated product. One scholar dismissed it. Economic debris. But another paused at the final lines, barely legible. We all spoil eventually, but good jars last. The oil is only remembered if someone records the weight before it is poured. And so Ionas was remembered not in speeches, but in silence. Not for what he sold, but for what he counted. Because even olive oil fades, but ledgers endure. Story 7. Grain inventory and daily logs at the Temple of Karnak. The sun over Thebes was a golden hammer, beating down on limestone walls, papyrus reeds, and mud brick homes. But within the vast stone embrace of the Temple of Karnak, shadows stretched long and cool. Great columns loomed like petrified forests. Incense smoke curled through the air. Scribes whispered. Priests chanted Dod, and in a plain storage chamber behind the hypostyle hall, a man named Peneat was counting grain. He was not a priest, not a noble, not even a servant of the gods, though he worked in their house. He was a grain recorder, assigned to the Temple of Ammon, responsible for the intake, storage, and logging of one of Egypt's most sacred commodities, barley. The temple's power was not only spiritual, it was economic. Offerings of grain came daily from farmers across Upper Egypt. Taxes in kind, tithes, tributes, harvests weighed and recorded. This grain fed the priests, paid the workers, and stocked the granaries during years of famine. And so Peneat rose each morning before Ra crested the horizon, walking barefoot to the storerooms beneath Karnak's eastern wall. The storage chambers were carved into the temple's foundation, dim and dry, sealed with reed doors and heavy with the scent of dust and grain. There, he began his daily ritual. Each delivery was logged. First, the farmer's name, then the volume of barley, measured in hecats, about 4.8 litre, s closing parenthesis. Then, the condition, clean, husked, infested. Finally, the intended destination, temple store, priestly allotment, bakery, brewery. Today's first delivery came from a village near the canal. 20 hecats, said the farmer, arms sunburned, robes streaked with river clay. Peneat nodded, beckoned for the overseer to bring the scale. A large hanging balance, counterweighted with standardized stones, stood in the center of the room. Peneat poured the barley into the weighing pan. It came in light 17 hecats. He looked at the farmer. The man shrugged. Some spilled on the boat. Peneat didn't scold. He simply made a mark in his wax tablet. Short delivery. Reason, transit loss. No penalty. He would cross-check it later against the man's previous records. If it happened again, there would be questions. By mid-morning, a line had formed. 5 more farmers, 2 couriers, and a temple runner with a grain requisition for brewing beer for the month's moon festival. The barley for brewing was measured twice, once for weight, once for aroma. Sour grain would ruin the brew, and gods, it was believed, could not abide spoiled beer. Each entry was made with care. Temple requisition. Brewing batch, 80 hecats. Quality, fresh. Condition, husked. Destination, brewery, Amman South. Private. Offering, farmer Bacanti, 12 hecats. 4. Funeral rites. Assigned, mortuary hall. Peniot wrote not on scrolls, but on clay tablets, pressing symbols with a reed stylus. The records were baked weekly and stored in clay jars sealed with wax and linen dot. He maintained 3 types of tablets. Daily receipts, every single delivery, logged by weight, name, and purpose. Granary inventory, total store, updated weekly. Adjustment logs, corrections, spoilage, theft. It was the 3rd set that kept him up at night. Last season, a rat infestation had destroyed part of the Westham granary. Peniot recorded the lost 43 hecats across 3 chambers. He had reported it honestly. The priests were not pleased. 43 hecats could have fed the singers for a month. One had hissed, but they were not eaten by singers. Peniot had replied. They were eaten by rats. He was nearly dismissed for insolence. Only his perfect record saved him as the day wore on. The granary heated. Dust rose with each new sack. Peniot wiped sweat from his brow and sipped water from a reed flask. His assistant, a boy named Nessiman, sorted the clay tags, each one stamped with the seal of its originating village. Master, Nessiman asked, do you think the gods read your numbers? Peniot smiled. No, but the priests do. And? If the priests are wrong, then the gods must sort it. Before sunset, Peniot closed his books for the day. He placed the clay tablets into a woven basket lined with sand to prevent chipping. The inventory total for the week stood at 3,204 hecats. A good number. As he left the chamber, he paused beside. The great wall where offering records were carved. Kings were named. Deeds described. Ships listed. Gold tallied, but never the grain. That was his job. Silent. Daily. Forgotten. Still, he wondered, would anyone ever remember the man who kept the food from spoiling? The one who recorded the truth, even when it didn't please the priests? Or would he, like so many sacks of barley, be stored quietly, then lost to rot? The next week began with a pounding at the storage chamber door. Peniot was bent over a tally tablet, inscribing totals from yesterday's deliveries when the temple's chief, scribe of provisions, Menkeper, entered with 2 guards and a scroll rolled tight beneath his arm. His expression, as always, was carved in limestone. There is a discrepancy, Menkeper announced. The guards, more for appearance than threat, stepped to either side of the room. Nessiman, Peniot's young assistant, shrank behind a stack. Of amphorae, Peniot stood calmly. In which account? Menkeper unfurled the scroll. The Eastern Granary reported 3,204 hecats. Actual, 3,142. You are missing 62. Peniot's fingers flexed slightly. That number includes the spoilage from last week's heat wave, he said. 40 hecats fermented. 18 assigned to emergency rations for the brewery. 4 taken to the Temple of Khonsu ceremonial use. I recorded it. Tablet 91A. Menkeper raised a brow. We have not received that tablet. Peniot walked to the archive box, unrolled a cloth bundle, and removed a fresh-baked clay slab. He held it out. Menkeper examined the markings. Fine, precise, undeniable. He grunted. It would be easier if you submitted reports earlier. It would be easier if the grain didn't spoil while waiting for your approval, Peniot replied. There was a pause. Menkhepper placed the tablet in his scroll bag and left without another word. The guards followed. The stone door creaked shut. Nesman exhaled. "That was close," he whispered. Peanut nodded, already returning to his tally dot by noon. The air inside the storage room was thick with dust. Nesman had noticed small black specks around several sacks. Peanut investigated and confirmed the worst weevils. Tiny holes in the grain, the telltale scent of spoilage. "We'll lose at least 30 hecats," he said. "Separate these sacks. Move them to the outer room. I'll record the infestation." He made a formal note in the spoilage log. Infestation, weevil contamination. Total affected, 31.5 hecats. Isolated for disposal or animal feed. Then he added a personal line, etched into his private tablet. Repeated weevil outbreaks in grain from Ackman. Suspect poor drying methods. Recommend rejection next season. It would not be read by the priests, but he trusted it more than any decree. Later, while preparing the brewery requisition, Peanut discovered another problem. The request was for 100 hecats, but only 88 were on hand. The rest lost to spoilage. He couldn't fulfill it without cutting into temple reserves. He considered lying. One word changed on the tablet would close the gap. Fewer questions, fewer visits from Menkhepper. But he didn't. He recorded exactly what was available and sent. The scroll up with a footnote. Shortfall due to spoilage. Recommend adjustment of ceremonial beer volume or temporary procurement from external stores. He placed a copy in his daily log. Then, in his private scroll, he wrote, "There is always a moment when one may lie. The gods are silent, but the numbers speak." At dusk, he reviewed his entire week's intake. He tallied. Grain received, 684. Hecats grain spoiled or lost, 61.3 hecats grain distributed. Ceremonial plus rations, 522. Hecats balance for storage, 100.7 hecats. The numbers balanced. Just barely dot as he sat beneath the low lamplight. He brushed sand from his tunic and closed the logbooks. Nesman handed him a date cake, slightly crushed. "Will you always do this?" The boy asked. "Count, record, never argue." Peanut thought. For a moment. "Yes," he said, "because someone must remember what was truly here." Still, he wondered. How many scribes bent over scrolls and tablets that were never read? How many numbers were copied not to inform, but to delay, confuse, or protect? Would his work so careful, so constant, survive long enough for someone to find meaning in it? Or would his ledgers be burned, swept into the Nile's flood, or shattered by time like broken seals beneath sand? The flood came early that year. It rolled down from the southern cataracts, swelling the Nile beyond its usual rhythm. Villages scrambled to lift goods, animals, and children onto high ground. Temple courtyards flooded. Priests waded through waist-deep water to save relics and statues in the granaries of Karnak. Peanut worked with his usual calm. He had seen high waters before once as a young boy, clinging to his mother's side as she shouted at temple guards to save their barley. But now, as the grainkeeper, he stood on the other side of the disaster. Not powerless, but prepared. When the waters lapped at the outer storage chamber's threshold, he had already elevated the most valuable grain jars onto raised platforms. He instructed Nesman and 2 others to bind the clay-sealed baskets with linen cords and smear the bases with pitch to keep out moisture. He didn't rush. He counted. He moved with the slow, deliberate urgency of someone who understood that most things can be replaced, but not the ledger. By nightfall, 2 outer storage rooms were lost. Amphorae floated, tumbled, shattered. The scent of fermented barley filled the air like sour wine. The guards panicked. The priests wailed. One blamed a misaligned offering. Another blamed the Nubians. Penaeus blamed water. And wait. The next morning, standing ankle-deep in sludge, he began tallying the damage. Western storehouse, 143 hecats lost southern chamber, 84 jars. Breached temple store, inner, intact personal. Ledger. Safety pressed the reed stylus into wet clay, forcing himself to write with precision even as his fingers trembled. That evening, Penaeus met with Menkaper in the Hall of Audits. The chief scribe scowled over the tally. This is unacceptable. The gods are ashamed. The gods are not the ones stacking jars, Penaeus replied evenly. There was silence. Menkaper tapped a long nail against the clay sheet. We will hold you responsible for the stores under your direct supervision. I already do. Penaeus said. The meeting ended without punishment. Yet. But Penaeus knew it would come, perhaps weeks later, in the form of reassignment, withholding of grain or quiet disappearance from temple lists. He walked home in silence. That night, he opened his private ledger, the one no one read, the one not pressed with royal seals or copied by apprentices. He added a final column titled Flood Year Tally. He recorded the total loss, noted the locations, and detailed the preparation steps taken in the days before. Then, beneath it, he wrote, They will blame what is lost, but they will not weigh what was saved. The next morning, he packed the scroll into a clay vessel lined with palm fibers and sealed it with pitch. He pressed his name Penaeus into the wet seal, followed by the glyph for grain and the symbol for truth. Then he carried the vessel deep into the temple's archive vault, past scrolls of hymns, spells, and royal decrees. In a low, unmarked shelf where rodents rarely ventured, he placed it gently behind the statue base. He never spoke of it again. A month later, Penaeus was reassigned to a more suitable posting, said the notice. He was sent south to an administrative outpost in Elephantine, where records were sparse, floods were rare, and scribes were few. He lived out his years counting with the same quiet care. No promotion. No monument, but centuries later, buried beneath layers of silt and temple collapse, archaeologists would unearth a sealed jar. Inside, a scroll written in a scribe's hand, not ornate, not poetic, just firm, deliberate, and precise. Its final lines read, This is the count. This is what was there. The temple will rise again. The flood will return. But let someone know, we counted as best we could. And so Penaeus' life forgotten by priests, omitted from the temple walls, was recorded after all. Not in stone, but in clay and truth. It was the year 1327 in the Kingdom of England. The land rumbled beneath knights and revolts, abbots and kings. Castles rose from the hills like frozen thunder, and the streets of London stank of ambition, sweat, and salted fish. But in the small stone chamber behind the Royal Exchequer at Westminster, a man named Edric of Wickham dipped his quill in ink and wrote another receipt. Not a charter, not a decree, not a speech or an illuminated prayer, just a receipt. His job, as defined by the Crown, was to record every payment made into or out of the royal accounts line by line, date by date. For every sack of grain sold, every shipment of wool taxed, every bridge toll collected or forgiven, Edric issued a small parchment note bearing the words, received into the hands of the king's clerks. Most were discarded the moment a transaction cleared, but he kept a copy of each, stitched into rough-bound ledgers, stored in a locked coffer beneath his desk. Each morning began the same way. He entered through the side gate of the Exchequer, nodded to the guards, stepped into the counting house, and removed his wool gloves. His fingers were stained gray-black from years of ink and dust. He sat at his narrow bench beside the scales and cash boxes, opened the day's transaction log, and wrote, Today's first entry. On the 12th day of November, received from John of Wycliffe, 18 shillings and 9 pence for the passage of 3 carts upon the road to Reading, accounted as toll. Then, paid to Brother Harold, Abbey of St. Albans, £3 for upkeep of infirm monks, per writ of royal relief. Each entry was written twice, once on a loose parchment to be handed to the payer, and once in the official book. Receipts bore Edric's name and a crude wax seal of the exchequer, half melted from reuse, smudged, slightly off-center. He kept a record of seal anomalies too, not because anyone asked him to, but because he noticed that by midday he had written 37. Receipts. The chamber was quiet. The only sounds were the scratching of quills, the clink of coins into the iron box, and the occasional cough from the treasury bailiff in the next room. A clerk from the wool customs house arrived. "We need an emergency dispensation receipt overpaid." "Merchants, how much?" £16. "Name?" "They won't give it. Told me to write Friends of the Guild." Edric stared. "The Guild of Wool Merchants?" The clerk shrugged. He wrote anyway. Returned by writ. £16. Declared for Friends of the Guild. Unofficial attribution. Then, in his private copy, he added, "Entry suspicious. No writ of return received. Potential misdirection. Of Crown funds. Monitor for recurrence." No one would see that line but him. He maintained a second ledger hidden within a stack of defunct parchments, sealed with wax and wrapped in rough linen. It bore no royal sigil, only a title in faded ink, of things not meant to be seen. In it, he recorded overpayments that went uncorrected, names that recurred too often, funds redirected to unnamed parties, writs with altered dates, not to expose, not to accuse, but to remember. Edric had once dreamed of being a court scribe, copying charters, illuminating gospel books. But he had failed the final examination in Latin, grammar, and been offered this instead. Receipts. He took it without complaint, because someone, he believed, had to remember what was paid, and when, and why. He still recalled the worst day. The summer of 1323. A single storm had washed out a wooden bridge in Shropshire. Dozens died. The king ordered funds sent for repairs. Edric recorded the dispatch of 100 marks. But 6 months later, a local reeve arrived at the exchequer with a petition. No coin ever came. He said Edric had checked the books. The money had left the treasury. It was gone. He had written that receipt himself. He never forgot the line. Dispersed to Lord Alwyn for the reconstruction of Shropshire's North Bridge. As commanded. Lord Alwyn had never rebuilt the bridge. No one was punished. But Edric kept the parchment. That night, as the candles guttered and the exchequer emptied, Edric returned to his desk, inked his quill, and wrote one last entry into his private book. The books will remember, even if the kingdom forgets. And still he wondered, would these parchment scraps outlive him? Would anyone, centuries hence, brush dust from a forgotten receipt and find in it a kingdom's shape? Or would they be tossed in a fire, mistaken for nothing more than the dull murmurs of an unimportant man with a quill? It was the year 1327 in the Kingdom of England. The land rumbled beneath knights and revolts, abbots and kings. Castles rose from the hills like frozen thunder, and the streets of London stank of ambition, sweat, and salted fish. But in the small stone chamber behind the Royal Exchequer at Westminster, a man named Edric of Wickham dipped his quill in ink and wrote another receipt. Not a charter, not a decree, not a speech or an illuminated prayer, just a receipt. His job, as defined by the Crown, was to record every payment made into or out of the royal accounts, line by line, date by date. For every sack of grain sold, every shipment of wool taxed, every bridge toll collected or forgiven, Edric issued a small parchment note bearing the words, "Received into the hands of the king's clerks, ... Most were discarded the moment a transaction cleared, but he kept a copy of each, stitched into rough-bound ledgers, stored in a locked coffer beneath his desk. Each morning began the same way. He entered through the side gate of the exchequer, nodded to the guards, stepped into the counting house, and removed his wool gloves. His fingers were stained gray-black from years of ink and dust. He sat at his narrow bench beside the scales and cash boxes, opened the day's transaction log, and wrote, "Today's first entry. On the 12th day of November, received from John of Wycliffe, 18 shillings and 9 pence for the passage of 3 carts upon the road to Reading, accounted as toll. Then, paid to Brother Harold, Abbey of St. Albans, £3 for upkeep of infirm monks, per writ of royal relief." Each entry was written twice, once on a loose parchment to be handed to the payer, and once in the official book. Receipts bore Edric's name and a crude wax seal of the exchequer, half melted from reuse, smudged, slightly off-center. He kept a record of seal anomalies too, not because anyone asked him to, but because he noticed that by midday he had written 37. Receipts. The chamber was quiet. The only sounds were the scratching of quills, the clink of coins into the iron box, and the occasional cough from the treasury bailiff in the next room. A clerk from the wool customs house arrived. "We need an emergency dispensation receipt overpaid." "Merchants. How much?" £16. "Name?" "They won't give it. Told me to write Friends of the Guild." Edric stared. "The Guild of Wool Merchants?" The clerk shrugged. He wrote anyway. Returned by writ. £16. Declared for Friends of the Guild. Unofficial attribution. Then, in his private copy, he added, "Entry suspicious. No writ of return received. Potential misdirection. Of Crown funds. Monitor for recurrence." No one would see that line but him. He maintained a second ledger hidden within a stack of defunct parchments, sealed with wax and wrapped in rough linen. It bore no royal sigil, only a title in faded ink, of things not meant to be seen. In it, he recorded overpayments that went uncorrected, names that recurred too often, funds redirected to unnamed parties, writs with altered dates, not to expose, not to accuse, but to remember. Edric had once dreamed of being a court scribe, copying charters, illuminating gospel books. But he had failed the final examination in Latin, grammar, and been offered this instead. Receipts. He took it without complaint, because someone, he believed, had to remember what was paid, and when, and why. He still recalled the worst day. The summer of 1323. A single storm had washed out a wooden bridge in Shropshire. Dozens died. The king ordered funds sent for repairs. Edric recorded the dispatch of 100 marks. But 6 months later, a local reeve arrived at the exchequer with a petition. No coin ever came. He said that Edric had checked the books. The money had left the treasury. It was gone. He had written that receipt himself. He never forgot the line. Dispersed to Lord Alwyn for the reconstruction of Shropshire's North Bridge. As commanded. Lord Alwyn had never rebuilt the bridge, thought no one was punished. But Edric kept the parchment. That night, as the candles guttered and the exchequer emptied, Edric returned to his desk, inked his quill, and wrote one last entry into his private book. The books will remember, even if the kingdom forgets. And still he wondered, would these parchment scraps outlive him? Would anyone, centuries hence, brush dust from a forgotten receipt and find in it a kingdom's shape? Or would they be tossed in a fire, mistaken, for nothing more than the dull murmurs of an unimportant man with a quill? By spring, the streets of Westminster were filled with mud and murmurs, whispers of rebellion, questions about the king's debts, grain prices rising, nobles shifting allegiances. And amid it all, Edric of Wickham still sat at his desk, scratching receipts onto parchment as though nothing in England had changed. But something had. One afternoon, a royal official arrived without notice. Not a courier, not a clerk and advisor to the crown. His robes were dark, trimmed in gold, and he carried no scroll. Only a small pouch of coins and a list. "I need you to write receipts," the man said, laying the pouch on Edric's desk. "But no names." Edric paused. "No names at all?" "Just the amounts. The purpose is understood." The advisor turned to leave. "It is royal business." The pouch held 50 pounds in coin enough to fund a bridge or pay a garrison. No ledger line accompanied it. No accounting code. No authorization. Still, Edric wrote the receipts. Received, 10 pounds. Purpose not disclosed. Received, 15 pounds. Royal disbursement, confidential. Received, 25 pounds. At royal instruction, no record of recipient. Then, in his private ledger, he wrote, 50 pounds issued without oversight. Requested anonymity. Purpose unknown. Likely funding for political bribe or secret campaign. Patent accelerating. That evening, he walked home beneath low clouds and chimney smoke. He passed a man shouting on a street corner about injustice. "The king eats off gold, and we eat roots," someone cried. Edric said nothing, but he made a mental note. The city has begun to notice what is missing. The next morning, he found a different visitor waiting at his desk, a man in gray robes. Silent, hands clasped behind his back. "I've been told you keep a second ledger," the man said. Edric's chest tightened. "I keep only the king's books. There are whispers that you copy what others discard. I copy only what is paid." The man stared, then smiled without warmth. "The king appreciates loyalty. The kingdom survives on discretion." And he left. Edric didn't return home that night. Instead, he returned to the exchequer at dusk, unlocked his iron-bound chest, and removed his private ledger. It was thick now, over 20 years of marginal truths. Corrections no one requested. Names that recurred too often. Payments that should not have been made. He opened to the final page dot by candlelight. With a shaking hand, he wrote, "This is my last entry. I recorded what I saw. I confirmed what was given. I withheld no figure. I lied only when silence became the last kind of truth." If these pages are ever read, know this. England was not made of kings. It was built by those who wrote down what the kings forgot. He placed the ledger in a bundle of firewood at the rear of the exchequer, wrapped in oilskin, hidden behind half-burnt ledgers and broken stools. Then he left. No one ever recorded. Edric of Wickham's death. No one wrote a receipt for the man who had written thousands. But centuries later, during a renovation of the old treasury vaults, a strange bundle was found behind a false wall. It contained a weathered ledger. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was precise. Scholars dismissed it at first. Financial debris, they said. But one noticed something unusual. In the margins were notes, quiet, personal, exact. They were not about coin alone. They were about motive, patterns, consequence. One line read, "This entry was made for silence. But the numbers remember." And so, the kingdom had forgotten him, but the receipts had not.